All right, getting right into it today. We're doing deep dive on Jeffrey Dahmer. You guys sent in some excerpts from his Wikipedia page, and wow, it's quite a story, to say the least, going from a seemingly normal beginning to becoming, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history.
Yeah. And, I think as we kind of unpack this, really what's important to think about is not to just rehash all the gruesome details of Dahmer's crimes, but rather try to understand the man himself,
Right.
to piece together a picture of, his development and what his early life was like, his environment, and see if we can identify, factors that might have contributed to him becoming, the monster that the world came to know.
Absolutely. And I think it's important, right off the bat to say we're going to be talking about some really, really tough concepts. Very disturbing concepts, necrophilia and cannibalism, the legal definition of sanity, all very, very complex stuff. But, we're here to inform. We're here to analyze. We're here to understand. We're not here to sensationalize.
Exactly. And while we're going to be delving into the complexities of Dahmer's psyche, we have to remember the victims, the real people whose lives were cut short. Their stories are what truly matter.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. So let's start at the beginning. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1960. Accounts of his early childhood, he was a relatively normal kid, even happy it seems. And then around the age of 4, things seemed to shift a little bit.
Yeah. He undergoes surgery for a double hernia. And from that point on, he kind of becomes, noticeably more subdued and withdrawn, almost like a light went out. Now, whether the surgery itself was a direct cause, we can't say for sure, but it does seem to coincide with this change in his demeanor.
And, this is also the time when there's a lot of turmoil in his family.
Hmm.
His parents' relationship, very volatile, lots of arguments. His mother struggling with her mental health, relying heavily on medication. That kind of environment for a young child who's already undergoing, kind of a shift in personality.
Yeah, I mean, it couldn't have been easy for him, right? And then on top of that, the family moved around a lot during this period, which probably added to his, sense of isolation. It's hard when you're constantly being uprooted like that to form those stable relationships as a child.
Absolutely. And, one of the details about Dahmer's childhood that I thought was just so striking was his fascination with animal anatomy. It started out seemingly innocently enough, collecting insects. Kids do that all the time. And then it progressed. He started dissecting roadkill that he would find and even collecting and like displaying animal remains.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting, right? It's actually not uncommon to see a fascination with, death and kind of the macabre and the developmental histories of serial killers. But there's this one detail. He asks his father about how to bleach chicken bones. And his father actually helps him with the process, kind of viewed it as harmless scientific curiosity.
Wow. It's almost like a dress rehearsal, isn't it? For what he would eventually go on to do. Leaching bones in the family kitchen, it's unsettling to think about.
Yeah, and it kind of makes you wonder about family dynamics and shaping a child's perception of what's acceptable, what's normal,
That's
right?
it.
I mean, you have to wonder if that seemingly, innocuous interaction, that lack of healthy boundaries around this kind of morbid curiosity, could it have contributed to his later, distorted views of death and the human body?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And then, of course, we have adolescence, a time when, most kids are trying to fit in and figure themselves out.
Mm.
But for Dahmer, this period was just marked by kind of increasing isolation and, those disturbing tendencies that just continued to deepen.
He was an outcast. He was a loner at Revere High School, started drinking heavily. He'd hide alcohol in his jacket, even referred to it as medicine.
Yeah.
He was aware of his homosexuality, but kept it a secret from his parents. I mean, you can just imagine that inner turmoil that he must have been going through.
Yeah, trying to reconcile those, emerging parts of himself. Absolutely. And it's during this period that his kind of fantasies about control, domination really start to take hold. And disturbingly, they seem to get intertwined with his interest in anatomy.
And there's this detail from his high school years. He would stage these pranks. He would call them doing a Dahmer. And they involve things like, mimicking seizures or other medical conditions. On the surface, it might just seem like typical teenage antics. But knowing what we know now, it takes on a very different light, doesn't it?
It's almost like he was rehearsing,
Yeah.
exploring, those themes of control and manipulation, just in a very, very disturbing way.
Yeah, seeking attention, even if it was negative attention, kind of a twisted form of expression. It kind of offers a glimpse into his psyche, this
Yeah.
growing need to exert power over others, even if it was through these strained performances.
And then comes graduation in 1978. And just a few weeks later, his first murder. He picks up this hitchhiker, Stephen Hicks, and, well, it all starts to unravel.
Yeah, this is where things take a really dark turn. The details of that crime are horrific. But what I find really significant is what Dahmer himself said about the trigger. He stated that the sight of Hicks' bare chest sparked a sexual response in him. And this suggests a really early and very powerful link between physical attraction and his violent urges.
And it wasn't just like a random act. It wasn't an impulsive act of violence. He carefully planned it, executed this murder, and he disposed of Hicks's remains in a way that just shows a really disturbing level of forethought and awareness
Yeah.
of forensic techniques. Like he was already thinking steps ahead, even in that first act.
Chilling. It was chilling. And then, there's this period after that that you can almost describe as like a drifting. He enlists in the army, but then he gets discharged because of alcoholism. Moves to Florida, works odd jobs, continues, to struggle with this alcohol abuse. It's almost as if he's trying to outrun something, but the darkness is always there.
Always lurking.
Right. Under the surface.
Absolutely. And then eventually he returns to Ohio, lives with his father and stepmother for a little bit, then moves in with his grandmother in Wisconsin. Despite, his family's efforts, his life is just spiraling.
Yeah, and it's during this time that we see a very clear escalation in his criminal behavior. He's got run-ins with the law, indecent exposure, sexual assault charges, and his behavior in gay bathhouses, it becomes really concerning. He's drugging his partners, trying to control their movements during these sexual encounters. It's a pretty disturbing indication that his need for domination, for absolute power over his victims is deepening.
It's chilling to think that he, during this time, he actually expressed regret for his earlier crimes. He knew what he was doing was wrong, yet he just felt this powerlessness to stop himself. It was like he was trapped in this nightmare that he created. And then comes what many experts believe to be the turning point. The murder of Stephen Twomey.
Yeah, the murder of Twomey in '87 is significant for a couple reasons. It really marks the beginning of a much more frequent and a much more brutal pattern of killing. And what's particularly striking is that Dahmer claimed to have no memory of killing Twomey. And this suggests that he may have been in a dissociative state, maybe even like a blackout.
Hold on. Can you explain what a dissociative state is? I'm not sure everyone's familiar with that.
Yeah, so essentially it's a mental process where a person disconnects from their thoughts, their feelings, memories, even their sense of self. And it can be triggered by trauma, extreme stress, substance abuse. In Dahmer's case, it's very possible the combination of his alcohol use and his escalating compulsions, it led to this type of break. It raises some serious questions about, his mental state at the time and the degree to which he was really in control of his actions.
Absolutely. That's a really, really important point. It just adds another layer of complexity to this already incredibly disturbing case.
It does. And from this point on, Dahmer's crimes become even more ritualistic, even more horrific. He's actively seeking out victims, often luring them from these gay bars in Milwaukee, drugging, strangulation, dismemberment, the posing of bodies. All of this becomes, hallmarks of his modus operandi.
And it's during this period that he starts experimenting with preserving body parts, creating what he called trophies. This is a very, perverse desire to keep these victims close, even in death. It's hard to even wrap your mind around.
It's truly disturbing. And then tragically, of course, you have the case of Connor Synthesumphone, a 14-year-old boy. He was actually the younger brother of a boy that Dahmer had previously molested. What makes this case particularly heartbreaking and frankly infuriating is the involvement of the police. Witnesses saw Connor with Dahmer. He was clearly injured, disoriented. They called the police,
But in a just unbelievable lapse of judgment, the officers, they returned Connor to Dahmer despite the obvious warning signs. We'll get into that more in a minute. But
it's unimaginable, isn't it?
yeah, it's hard to fathom.
It speaks to a systemic failure, doesn't it? A failure to recognize the vulnerability of this young boy coming from a marginalized community. A failure to really investigate and challenge Dahmer's lies. And ultimately, a failure to protect a child who was clearly in desperate need of help.
Yeah. It's infuriating. And it makes you wonder how many other warning signs were missed. How many other opportunities were there to stop Dahmer before it got to this point?
Sadly, Connor's death was not the end. Dahmer continued his spree and claimed more victims in the weeks that followed. It wasn't until July of '91 that his gruesome acts were finally brought to an end, thanks to, well, a pretty remarkable escape.
You're talking about Tracy Edwards, his final intended victim.
Right.
who managed to break free and, lead the police straight to Dahmer.
Yeah, Edwards, still handcuffed, was able to get out of Dahmer's apartment and flag down a passing police car. I mean, the terror that he must have felt, the courage it took to escape and seek help.
And when those officers entered Dahmer's apartment, it was like something out of a nightmare. Photographs, body parts, that infamous acid drum that he used to dispose of his victims, the sheer scale of his crimes. It was just horrifying.
Yeah, but amidst all that horror, I imagine there must have been a sense of relief, too. This monster was finally caught. His reign of terror was over.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Dahmer, to everyone's surprise, confesses to everything in chilling detail.
His confessions really provide this disturbingly detailed account of his motives and his rituals. The escalating compulsions that drove him to kill. He talked about his desire for control and this really twisted kind of companionship, and even a desire to make his victims a permanent part of her.
And that idea of making his victims a permanent part of them, this is where that concept of necrophilia comes in, right?
Exactly. Necrophilia is a paraphilia, a sexual deviation characterized by a persistent and intense sexual arousal from corpses. It's a really disturbing aspect of Dahmer's psyche. It further underscores the dehumanization of his victims, the way he viewed them as objects to be possessed and controlled even in death.
And then, of course, the cannibalism.
Yeah.
It's almost too horrific to even comprehend. What could possibly drive someone to consume the flesh of another human being?
It's a question that has baffled experts for centuries. In Dahmer's case, he claimed that he consumed parts of his victims in an attempt to make them a permanent part of him, both physically and spiritually. It was this grotesque expression of his desire for control, and in a way, it was his need for connection, however, twisted and perverse.
His trial, as you can imagine, was a media frenzy, and a lot of the focus centered on the question of his mental state.
Right. The central question being, did he meet the legal definition of insanity? In a legal context, insanity basically means that at the time of the crimes, the defendant couldn't understand the nature of their actions or to know the difference between right and wrong.
So basically, the defense was arguing that Dahmer was so mentally disturbed that he just couldn't be held responsible.
Exactly. But the prosecution argued that despite his very obvious psychological problems, Dahmer was fully aware of the wrongfulness of his actions. They pointed to his planning, his attempts to cover up the crimes, and even his confessions where he admitted to how depraved his acts were.
And the jury ultimately decided.
The jury found him legally sane on all counts, and he was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms for the murders in Wisconsin, plus another life sentence for a murder he committed in Ohio. So basically, he was going to spend the rest of his life behind bars.
It's interesting that during his imprisonment, he reportedly turned to Christianity. He was even baptized. And it kind of raises all these questions about the possibility of redemption, finding faith, seeking forgiveness, even for someone who had committed such horrific acts.
Yeah. It's really complex, isn't it?
Yeah.
For some people, it might just be impossible to reconcile the idea of redemption with, the magnitude of Dahmer's crimes. But it also speaks to this, enduring human capacity for change, for seeking meaning and purpose, even in the face of unimaginable darkness.
It's certainly something to ponder, and I can't imagine what it must have been like for the families of the victims, having to, grapple with the unimaginable loss, the grief, the anger, knowing that their loved ones were brutally murdered.
Yeah, the pain is unimaginable. And they were also forced to confront this reality that many of Dahmer's victims were from these marginalized communities, often young men of color. Their disappearances, they weren't always given the attention that they deserved.
It's a tragic pattern that we see, way too often in cases like this. Marginalized communities, disproportionately targeted.
Yeah.
And their disappearances are less likely to be investigated, their voices less likely to be heard.
It's a reminder of, the systemic inequalities that exist and the need to address the vulnerabilities that these communities face.
Laborna claimed that race wasn't a factor in his victim selection, that he was just, attracted to a certain body type. But can we really accept that at face value?
Well, it's tough to reconcile that with the fact that there's this undeniable pattern, right, of racial disparity among his victims. It forces us to confront this uncomfortable truth that, societal biases, whether they're conscious or unconscious, they can have a real impact, on who is targeted, who is believed, and who is protected.
It's a conversation that we need to be having, and a reality that we have to confront if we want to create a more just and equitable society for everyone. And that kind of brings us to to those really haunting questions, right? The what ifs. What if someone had noticed the signs earlier? What if the police had acted differently? What if Dahmer had gotten some, adequate mental health intervention?
Those what ifs, they're tough to wrestle with.
Yeah.
It's impossible to know for sure, if things could have been different. But I think it's crucial to ask those questions, to learn from these tragedies and to just strive to do better. And tragically, Dahmer's story doesn't end with imprisonment.
Yeah.
In 94, he was murdered by a fellow inmate.
A violent end to a very violent life.
Right. And while some people might see it as a form of justice, I think it also raises these questions about the nature of revenge and the purpose of punishment. Did Dahmer's death actually bring closure to the families, or did it just perpetuate this cycle of violence?
It's a really tough question
It is.
to answer. I think, it's important to remember that everyone involved in this case, from the victims to the families to Dahmer himself, they were all complex human beings.
Absolutely.
And while we can, analyze and try to understand the factors that led to these events, I think we just have to never forget the real human cost of what happened.
The human cost, exactly. And it's also important to acknowledge, the efforts that were made to prevent Dahmer's crimes from being sensationalized or exploited.
Yeah.
When his belongings, his tools, his artwork were put up for auction. A group called Milwaukee Civic Pride, they actually stepped in. And they raised enough money to buy and destroy most of those items, which prevented them from falling into the wrong hands.
It's a powerful statement, isn't it?
It is. It's a way for the community to reclaim some control. Prevent Dahmer's legacy from just being defined by his horrific acts. It's a statement that says, we will not allow this man to continue to victimize us, even in death.
It's a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, there's always hope, always that possibility of finding meaning, making a positive impact.
Exactly. And I think it's important for us, as we kind of go through these dark and disturbing cases, to remember that, to remember the resilience of the human spirit, and the power of compassion, the importance of seeking justice and understanding.
Well said. Well said. And I think that's a good place for us to pause and reflect on everything we've discussed so far.
I agree.
As we've been dissecting this case, going through all these details, I think it's easy to get caught up in the horror of it all. But it's important to step back and consider the broader implications of it all.
Yeah, it's not just about Jeffrey Dahmer, the individual, right? It's about these systemic issues, the societal failures that allowed someone like him to exist and to continue on for so long.
We've talked about the police missteps, the biases that might have been at play. But it goes so much deeper than that. I mean, you have to look at the stigma surrounding mental illness, the lack of access to adequate mental health care, especially for people from marginalized communities.
And it makes you wonder, right? If Dahmer had gotten the help that he clearly needed early on, if those signs had been recognized, if those signs had been addressed, could those 17 lives have been saved?
Yeah.
It's a question that, haunts every single case like this. And while we can't change the past, we can use it as a way to advocate for better mental health resources, challenge these discriminatory attitudes, and work towards a more just and equitable society.
I was thinking about Dahmer's childhood, the early fascination with death. I can't help but think about how often those kinds of things are dismissed as, boys being boys.
Yeah.
But maybe if someone had intervened, had taken those signs seriously.
It highlights the need for more awareness.
Yeah.
Not just among, professionals, but everyday people.
Yeah.
We need to create this culture where it's okay to seek help and okay to intervene when we see something that's just not right.
We've talked a lot about the victims, and rightfully so, but I think it's also important to acknowledge the impact this has on the community, as a whole. The fear, the mistrust, the lingering sense of unease.
Absolutely. Dahmer's crimes, they didn't just affect his victims. They kind of shattered the sense of safety in the community, especially within the gay community, which was, at the time already grappling with so much.
And it's a reminder that these crimes don't just happen in a vacuum.
Right.
They leave these scars on the fabric of society. And these scars can take generations to heal.
Mm-hmm.
And, while we can't undo the past, we can work towards a future where these kinds of things are less likely to happen.
And that's where, education comes in,
Yep.
understanding comes in, by learning about these cases, by really delving into the things that contribute to this, this violence and this criminality, we can equip ourselves to be more proactive, be more compassionate, and be more effective in preventing future tragedies.
It's more than just knowing the facts.
Right.
It's about fostering this culture of empathy and awareness and action, recognizing the warning signs, speaking up,
Yeah.
and advocating for a society that prioritizes, mental health and the well-being of everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Jeffrey Dahmer.
Yeah.
It's been a harrowing journey, but, I hope it's been informative.
Yes, I agree. I want to thank you, the listener, for joining us on this exploration. It's a heavy topic, but it's one that deserves our attention and our reflection, and ultimately our commitment to creating a better world.
As you've kind of processed everything that we've talked about today, I want to leave you with one final thought. If Dahmer's story teaches us anything, it's that evil doesn't always announce itself with, fanfare, flashing lights.
Right.
It often hides in the shadows, disguised as normalcy,
Yeah.
as harmless eccentricity. So be observant, be compassionate, never be afraid to speak up when you see something that's just not right. Because sometimes, the smallest act of courage can make all the difference in the world.
Absolutely.
The Conorak sent the some phone case, it's a really haunting example of how easily these signs can be missed. Or even worse, just completely ignored.
Yeah, and the fact that the officers, despite what the witnesses were saying, despite, the obvious signs of distress in this young boy, that they accepted Dahmer's explanation. It's mind-boggling.
It speaks to this kind of failure on multiple levels. The failure to recognize Conorak's vulnerability, right? He was a young boy from a marginalized community. And then the failure to really, truly investigate and challenge Dahmer's lies. And ultimately, the failure to protect a child who was in desperate need of help.
Yeah, it's infuriating. And it makes you think about all the other warning signs that might have been missed, all those missed opportunities to stop him before it got to this point.
And sadly, this wasn't the end. Dahmer continued on his spree. He claimed more victims after Conorak in the weeks that followed. It wasn't until July of '91 that it finally ended, thanks to a pretty remarkable escape.
You're talking about Tracy Edwards?
Yeah.
His final intended victim.
You're right.
Who managed to break free and, lead the police right to Dahmer.
Edwards, still in handcuffs, was able to get out of Dahmer's apartment and flag down a passing police car. The courage that must have taken.
Oh, absolutely. And then what those officers found in Dahmer's apartment, it was like a scene straight out of a nightmare. Photographs, body parts, the acid drum he used to dispose of his victims, the sheer scale of it, just horrific.
It's hard to even imagine. And yet, in the midst of all that horror, I imagine there must have also been a sense of relief.
Right, yeah.
This monster was finally caught. It was over.
Yeah, absolutely. And to everyone's surprise, Dahmer confesses to everything in pretty chilling detail.
Yeah, and those confessions, they provided investigators with a lot of information, a disturbingly detailed account of his motives, his rituals, the compulsions that just drove him to kill. He talked about that desire for control and a really twisted kind of companionship, and even that desire to, as he put it, make his victims a permanent part of him.
And that idea of making the victims a permanent part of him, this is where the whole concept of necrophilia comes in.
Exactly. It's a paraphilia, a sexual deviation. It's characterized by a persistent, very intense sexual arousal from corpses. It's just another layer of how disturbing his psyche really was.
And then the cannibalism. It's almost too horrific to even think about. What could possibly drive someone to consume the flesh of another human being?
It's a question that has baffled experts for centuries. In Dahmer's case, he claimed that he consumed parts of his victims to try and make them a permanent part of him, both physically and spiritually.
Wow.
It was a grotesque expression of his desire for control and, a really messed up need for connection.
Yeah, absolutely. His trial, as you can imagine, was a complete media frenzy.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the focus centered on, his mental state.
Right. Was he legally insane?
Yeah.
That was the big question.
Right.
Did he meet that legal definition of insanity?
So was the defense basically saying that he was just so disturbed that he couldn't be held accountable for his actions?
Yeah, that's exactly what they were arguing. But the prosecution, they argue that even with his obvious psychological issues, Dahmer was fully aware of the wrongfulness of his actions. And they pointed to things like his planning, his attempts to cover up what he'd done, even his confessions, where he acknowledges how awful it all was.
Yeah. And in the end, what did the jury decide?
In the end, the jury found him legally sane on all charges, and he was given 15 consecutive life terms for the murders he committed in Wisconsin, plus another life sentence for a murder in Ohio. Basically, he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison.
And it's so interesting, that while he's in prison, there are reports that he turned to Christianity, even went so far as to be baptized. It just makes you think about, the possibility of redemption, finding faith, seeking forgiveness, even after committing such horrible acts.
It's really complex, isn't it? I mean, for some, it might be impossible to reconcile those two things, but it does say something about, the human capacity for change. Seeking meaning and purpose even after being surrounded by, unimaginable darkness.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about. And I can't imagine, what the families of the victims must have gone through, having to deal with that loss, the grief, the
Yeah.
anger, knowing their loved ones were murdered.
No, it's unimaginable. And they also had to deal with the fact that a lot of Dahmer's victims were from these marginalized communities, often young men of color. Their disappearances weren't always given the attention they deserved.
Yeah, and it's a tragic pattern, that we've seen in so many cases. Marginalized communities are disproportionately targeted, and their disappearances are less likely to be investigated.
Yeah, it's a reminder of those inequalities, that exist and the need to address the vulnerabilities of these communities.
And Dahmer, he claimed that race wasn't a factor in his victim selection,
Yeah.
that he was just, attracted to a certain body type. I mean, can we really accept that?
I mean, it's really hard to reconcile his claims with, the reality of it all.
Yeah.
There's this undeniable pattern of racial disparity. It forces us to kind of confront these uncomfortable truths, right? That these societal biases, whether we're aware of them or not, they can have a huge impact. Who's targeted, who's believed, who's
And
protected.
it's a conversation that we need to have. And it's a reality that we need to confront, especially if we're trying to create a more just and equitable society.
Right. And that kind of brings us to those really haunting questions. What if someone had noticed the signs? What if the police had acted differently? What if Dahmer had gotten, adequate help, mental health help? Those what ifs are so tough to grapple with. We can't change the past, but we can learn from these tragedies. We can try to do better in the future. And Dahmer's story, sadly, it doesn't end with just imprisonment. In 1994, he was murdered by a fellow inmate.
Wow. A violent end to a very violent life.
And while some might see that as some form of justice, it does raise all these questions about revenge and punishment. Did his death actually bring closure to the families? Or did it just keep that cycle of violence going?
It's a really hard question.
It is. And, I think it's important to remember that everyone, in this case, the victims, their families, and Dahmer himself, I mean, they were all complex people.
Yeah.
And while we can analyze and, try to understand how these events happen, we can't ever forget the human cost.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really important to remember the efforts that were made to kind of prevent all of this from being sensationalized or exploited.
Hmm.
When his belongings, his tools, artwork, all that was put up for auction. A group called Milwaukee Civic Pride stepped in, and they raised enough money to buy and destroy most of those items, just to keep them out of the wrong hands.
Yeah, what a powerful way for the community to reclaim control. To not let his legacy just be defined by these horrible acts, and a reminder that even in the face of all this darkness, there's always hope. There's always the possibility of finding meaning and making a positive impact.
That's a really good point.
And I think it's important for us, as we dig deeper into these dark and disturbing cases, we have to remember that. Remember the resilience of the human spirit,
Mhm.
the power of compassion, the importance of seeking justice and understanding.
I think that's a really good place for us to pause and reflect on what we've talked about. As we've been going through all this, I mean, dissecting this case, going through all these details, it's so easy to just get completely lost in the horror of it.
Right. But I think we really need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture.
I agree. It's not just about Jeffrey Dahmer. It's about the systemic problems,
Hmm.
the societal failures that allowed someone like him to exist and to continue to do what he did for so long.
Absolutely. And, we've talked about the police missteps,
Hmm.
the biases that might have played a part, but it goes deeper than that. You have to look at the stigma that surrounds mental illness and the lack of, real access to mental health care,
Especially for people from marginalized communities.
especially for people from marginalized communities. And it just makes you wonder, what if he had gotten the help that he so clearly needed early on?
Yeah.
What if, someone had seen those signs and addressed them? Could those 17 lives have been saved? It's a question that just lingers. And while we can't change what happened, we can use these, these tragedies to advocate for better mental health resources. We can challenge the discrimination, work towards a society that's just, more equitable for everyone.
I was thinking about Dahmer's childhood, and his fascination with death,
Yeah.
and how often those kinds of things are just dismissed as, boys being boys. What if someone had intervened? What if someone had taken those signs seriously?
That's such an important point. We need more awareness, and not just among professionals, right? We need it everywhere. Everyday people.
Mm-hmm.
We need to create a culture where people feel comfortable seeking help and intervening when something's not right.
Yeah, for sure. And, we've talked a lot about the victims, and rightfully so,
Yeah.
but I think we also need to consider the impact this had on the community
Yeah.
as a whole, right?
Absolutely. The fear, the mistrust, it shattered the sense of safety in the community, especially, within the gay community, which was already facing so much at the time.
And it's a reminder that these crimes, they don't happen in isolation. They leave scars, scars that take generations to heal.
And while we can't go back in time and change anything, we can, work towards a future where these kinds of things are less likely to happen.
Yeah.
And that's really where education and understanding becomes so important, don't they?
Absolutely.
Learning about these cases,
Again.
delving into why they happen, it's how we equip ourselves to prevent these tragedies.
Yeah. And it's more than just knowing the facts. It's about fostering empathy. It's about fostering awareness,
Yeah.
action, recognizing those warning signs, speaking up,
Mhm.
and fighting for a society that prioritizes the well-being of everyone.
You said it perfectly.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Jeffrey Dahmer.
It has been a harrowing journey, but I hope it's been informative.
Yeah, I agree. I want to thank you, the listener, for going on this journey with us. It's a tough topic, but it's something that deserves our attention, our reflection, and our commitment to creating a better world.
If Dahmer's story teaches us one thing, it's that evil doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always come with fanfare and bright lights. It often hides, it hides in the shadows, disguised as normal.
Absolutely.
So be observant, be compassionate, and don't ever be afraid to speak up when you see something that just isn't right. Because you never know, even the smallest act of courage could make all the difference.
Well said.